the fucking dog. Walking the dog with Satokata Takahashi.
All right. Cool. Well, we've been recording for about 10 seconds now.
Oh, really?
And we're already walking that dog.
With Satokata Takahashi.
Yeah. Saw a guy wearing a shirt today that said, I'm in paradise on it, walking down the street. And I immediately wanted to yell at him.
In many ways, we're living in hell right now.
Yeah, it's true.
Well, let's walk this dog. Here we go.
Satanicus.
All right.
Oh, that's a new one.
Starting to feel it. Homo Satanicus?
Homo Satanicus.
We had it. It goes back a little bit.
Yeah.
We barely ever used it. I never have a reason to use. It's just I need, there's rarely an opportunity for this. All right. Well, welcome to The Empire Never Ended with Boris and Fritz and Ray.
Hey.
Hello.
All of our distinct personalities, histories, feelings, realities.
Coming together as one.
As one voice. Yeah, here we are. And
This is a serious issue.
we got a serious issue.
Who is that?
So that was well, I mean,
They're going to be cursed by God.
it's that guy.
Ah, okay.
They're going to be cursed by God.
I did a little updating today.
Do you have him saying Jerusalem?
Jerusalem.
I am nothing if not a completionist. All right. Yeah, so we're going to be joined a little bit by Rick Allen, Congressman Rick Allen today. For no particular reason. He doesn't really fit.
He absolutely does not fit into the 1930s and 40s. Well, although maybe he does. I mean, that is...
I mean, yes, listen to this guy's voice.
They're going to be cursed by God.
I mean, where does he come from? It's not now.
I mean, I could hear him say, like, things about segregation.
Oh my God, yes. Yes, I'm sure he has. In fact, I think I'm going to be paying attention to Rick. I feel like he's going to offer us a lot.
You should.
Moving forward. But, wow. I don't think clips exist for this topic. So this is what I brought. I mean, this is a pretty obscure topic, I think. Huh?
It is. It's a little obscure. I mean, and I figured since we're getting to the end of well, we've been saying this for a while, end of the 30s and 40s.
Yeah, I think we're doing that. We're in the transition now.
We're in the transition
I think we're
now.
going to keep kind of bumping back and forth a bit, Like, we got some stuff planned that's going to also be a lot more post-war focus really soon.
It's time to get out of the post.
I think we're moving now, yeah.
Time to get out of this period. But
yeah.
I think we would be remiss not to mention this, well, I don't know if I should say one organization or multiple organizations or a movement or a tendency.
Uh-huh.
And that is, let's say, the Japanese efforts to court support in Black America.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, you see what I mean by kind of obscure? Like, we don't, it's not, not a common story. But it did already come up on our show briefly.
It did. And I'm trying to think back,
Lawrence Dennis is why. Because towards the end of Lawrence Dennis, for those who didn't hear those episodes, was an American, we'll say, fascist intellectual who happened to have Black parentage that he hid for many, many, many years. And at one point was investigated by the FBI specifically on his racial background and his connection to Japanese embassies. Because these two things together were part of a larger effort that we're going to be talking about today.
Yes.
And it was also, we said in those Lawrence Dennis episodes, one of those aha moments for the feds where they were like, racism has consequences.
Right. I mean, there was kind of an aha moment throughout this, or at least like after Pearl Harbor started, after, the U.S. got into World War II.
Uh-huh.
Do you remember if Lawrence Dennis was accused of being associated with the Black Dragon Society?
Well, there were rumors. I don't remember if there were charges in the end when he was actually brought to court on that.
Right.
But there was talk, and definitely there were open fears. I mean, like FBI investigations were openly worried about that, so they were at least investigating it.
Yeah, I mean that seemed to be the general paranoia was this around this Black Dragon Society.
Can I just pause and say how fucking sweet of a name that is?
It's very cool.
Yeah.
Will you be talking about it today?
Yes, we will.
Nice.
Black Dragon Society. Love it.
Even though, well, yeah, I mean we'll get there, but it's funny that they, just based on the fact that he is black and white passing, they assumed that he was probably connected to the pro-Japanese elements in like the Black nationalist movement.
He did have friends in the Japanese imperialists.
Yeah, but he had friends everywhere.
He did have friends everywhere. Exactly.
I mean,
right.
okay, he was
Exactly
also a
right.
fascist.
He was a fascist.
Yeah.
But he actually, met real Nazis.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And none of these people that we're going to talk about today
Mhm.
would necessarily want that or ever have that opportunity.
Yeah. Right. Right.
Yeah.
And the Nazis probably wouldn't want to meet with them.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And, the organization that I'm primarily going to talk about today definitely it was never really the threat that it was made out to be, which is something that we've seen over and over again. But it does have kind of implications and interesting connections that go beyond just the Pacific movement of the Eastern world. And that is, for example, in the shaping the ideology of the nascent Nation of Islam at the time period and the like. And I think it's kind of an interesting example of how certain reactionary governments and movements can capitalize on pretty real grievances.
Yeah.
And also kind of show how collaborationism could potentially happen or does happen in different circumstances. Not that it did happen in this case,
Right.
or even really ever had the potential to,
Okay. Yeah.
unless the Japanese actually invaded the US.
Right. Which sort of a fantasy of Robert Heinlein's that we might have time to talk about.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Because we did a little bit about the Invasion USA series, and it turns out, and I'm sure this exact paranoia was part of this book, but John W. Campbell, the Astounding editor, did have him write another treatment of the Invasion USA trope where the US is invaded by, let's just say Asian hordes.
Right.
And this was also kind of a fifth column sort of activity.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Also, you have like Man in the High Castle,
Right.
Philip K.
Right.
Dick.
Mm-hmm.
So the western coast of the U.S. is occupied by Japan.
Right.
Mhm.
In that book, yeah.
But I don't recall in the background lore how Japan came to occupy. I think they got it as spoil of war, though, right?
Yeah.
Instead of like a
Mhm.
but that's still Invasion USA.
And they,
right?
and they
Yeah, you're
subjugate
right,
white
you're right.
people, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah. I haven't read that book in many years.
Me neither. I watched
Oh.
the show years back
Yeah.
as well, but
As I recall, whites do have kind of a second class status.
right.
But not. I don't think it's like law, but whatever.
Mm.
Which may be, him reading accounts of like what the Japanese did to the British in Hong Kong or Singapore, which, you had these accounts of the British, for example, colonial administrators expected that the Japanese would just continue to keep them in
Mhm.
administration.
Yeah.
And, they could be quislings.
Yeah.
Instead, they, send them off into camps
Damn.
and stuff.
Mhm.
Yeah, so I guess that's probably an articulation of that
Yeah.
unexpected fear. Yeah.
In this country?
Imagine.
But you know what? It struck me when I was reading about this too, is that it's very different from other groups we talked about from the same time period, like the Bunds
Yeah.
or, Italian American fascists or, von Siatsky or whatever, because the Japanese aligned groups, they weren't never trying to bend over backwards to prove their Americanness.
Yeah.
Instead, it was quite the opposite,
Mm.
right? The US government was the enemy,
Mm-hmm.
which, the Bund and everybody else were trying very hard to,
Yeah.
show themselves as model Americans that they're displaying Americanism.
Well, I suppose also, the Germans didn't get rounded up into fucking concentration camps by the U.S. government,
Right.
Yeah.
That helps.
They instead went to summer camps. Totally different philosophy of camping.
Well, also, I mean, a lot of people were hoping maybe the Japanese will get us the fuck out of the U.S.
Yeah.
Which is kind of the opposite of what a lot of these immigrants wanted.
Yeah, right.
I think to some extent, a lot of leftists maybe know about W.E.B. Du Bois's pro-Japanese sentiments, and that's been talked about. I think the greater history of the Pacific movement of the Eastern world and some of these other groups is kind of been forgotten. And again, I think they weren't really a threat. And kind of like the Sinarquistas, you had these big panics about how many people were involved, or that they were, being directed by this mysterious force of a foreign power.
Right. Yeah.
And, the Sinarquistas at least had an organization and structure that was modeled after kind of European fascist groups.
Yeah.
Whereas that doesn't really seem to be the case here. The pro-Tokyo African-American groups, insofar as they actually existed as movements, kind of varied ideologically from proto-Nation of Islam to Garveyism to people like Du Bois. I mean, so it's kind of all over the place.
Yeah.
So it's kind of more of a general sentiment, I guess I'd say, than an anger against, obvious systemic racism and racial violence that was happening at the time. And a good place to situate the panic that the U.S. government had when they realized that potentially, them being terrible to black people might have implications on the war effort.
Yes.
Comes from a survey that was done in New York City right after the war broke out. And this Gerald Horne cites it in one of his books about this. That in 1942, a poll found that 18% of black New Yorkers said they would be better off under the Japanese. An additional 31% declared that their treatment would be the same.
Interesting.
And only 28% said it would be worse.
Ooh, that's gotta hurt.
And so, yeah, I mean, you get this kind of, you get this kind of survey in 1942, and the U.S. government's all of a sudden like, wait, there might be a little threat to national security here. Maybe we should do something about this. And this, of course, when you get into some of the big propaganda efforts, where, they enlist Hollywood and the record industry to gear pro-war propaganda towards black populations.
Does any one of these people does it occur to them to just form a thought that racism is the threat to national security? Or
yeah. I mean, the mainstream black press did the Double V campaign, and we'll talk about that towards the end of this because there's good reason for that. But that's victory in the war and victory at home.
Okay, I thought you were being profane.
No.
Okay.
Very much
Some
not.
kind of look it up on Urban Dictionary.
And some people do also think that this maybe was the reason that after the war, the U.S. government was becoming more inclined to make some reforms in terms of desegregation.
Yeah,
because going into a Cold War,
please don't fifth column us because we racism you forever. Is that Can we? And
then of course, ironically, they use the opportunity when the war starts to crack down on groups that they had been monitoring and were planning on, rounding up and cracking down on anyways.
Okay.
So yeah, it's a kind of grim story all the way around. But wait, so that's kind of par for the course for our show.
It simultaneously sort of encouraged them to, let's say, loosen up on the hardcore racism of the preceding decades, while simultaneously led them to cracking down on black radical groups.
Yeah, I mean, you'll see that there wasn't really that much easing up on on racism. I mean, that's a whole other topic of conversation.
Yeah.
But I mean, racial violence continued during the war. Yeah. Just, as we talked about the Zoot Suit riots, there were multiple, riot's a really deceptive term for this.
Yes.
For mass violence, again, targeting a population.
Yeah. We have words like Pogrom.
Pogrom.
You
Yeah,
know?
absolutely.
Not a word that American historians love to use in the U.S., even though
Not a lot of white ones.
so many opportunities. You know? All right.
So I think in order to trace back the origins of pro-Japanese sentiment in like the African American community at large, we need to kind of go back to the beginning of the 20th century.
Well, you know what we didn't do, though?
We didn't go to the 19th century.
So I think that's a win.
But I think, a lot of historians agree that the Japanese defeat over Russia in the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 dealt a major blow to the confidence of European imperial powers.
Yeah.
And, their infinite ability to expand at the expense of non-white nations everywhere in the world.
They were having all sorts of crises, those poor white ruling class guys.
Yeah.
They were really having a tough few decades.
It was a pretty big deal, though. I mean, the fucked up Russia a lot, too.
Yeah.
And, the rising power of the Japanese Empire was seen as potentially ushering in a new era in which subjugated peoples of the world could look up to another non-white powerful civilization in the world that would, advocate on their behalf.
Yeah.
Which is kind of like, not too unlike how, well, maybe we don't even need to go there, but like,
I can think of a ton of example.
Yeah.
You don't even have to say them, but like, I mean, there's a lot of different, let's say, nation states or proto-nation states that take on that mantle throughout different periods of
Right.
American protest history, where
or even in,
or global movements. I mean, I'm not even trying to minimize it, but
the emergence of nation states
Yeah.
coming out of, the Ottoman Empire, and the Middle East and, whatever, around the same time period, definitely also inspires revolutionary activity of a particular kind. 1905 definitely causes considerable amount of excitement in the black press, including intellectuals. So W.E.B. Du Bois, we talked about, even in Booker Washington, even though they disagreed about a great many things, kind of both spoke fondly about Japan before World War II and then, and like before World War I even. So after 1905 and going on into the next decades. Marcus Garvey and Nunia were probably the loudest and most prominent advocates for Japan. And that would be kind of important for the way that this develops in the future.
Yeah.
Then, of course, there's, American imperialist expeditions into the Philippines and into the Pacific, which, coupled with the plight of Asian immigrants facing racist discrimination, also arouses a lot of sympathy towards Asian communities in the U.S. and abroad, right?
Is this also where do we also now explain this term that Lawrence Dennis was using back in those episodes when he was referring to or implying a black fascism by calling it an Asiatic fascism, but he was clearly talking about like American black people. Do you remember this? It was a very kind of strange term to hear.
No, actually, I don't remember that, but that is interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it might be referring to that.
We mentioned back then that there's like a Moorish usage of that term.
We weren't really.
Right. And actually, we'll get to that because Nation of Islam uses that as well.
Right.
And it seems to maybe come from the interaction with some of these pro-Japanese, Pan-Asianist agents that were working.
Maybe he did have a relationship to this scene, yeah.
Or at least he probably knew about it, for sure.
Huh.
I mean, he seemed to...
He's in the circles. He's in every circle.
He's in every circle. Yeah. And, for their part, the Empire of Japan also explicitly championed themselves as an advocate for non-European peoples, right? In the world and standing up to European hegemony. And so, like, in the immediate aftermath of...
They were famously great.
I was about to say, I'm sure when they were explaining this to the Chinese, they were very receptive to this.
Yeah. But, in the immediate aftermath of World War I, Japan tries to push through an amendment to the Treaty of Versailles called the Racial Equality Proposal, which was, it's a little bit of a deceptive name because it was a proposal to end racial discrimination in the League of Nations.
Okay.
And so, like, for all nations to have kind of an equal footing despite whether or not they're, European and white.
Right. Just thought someone had to say it out loud. That's all.
And of course, surprise, surprise, it wasn't enacted largely due to opposition from the United States and British Empire Commonwealth, such as Australia and New Zealand.
We are just so good at choosing sides in historical debates.
Australia obviously thought it would be a threat to their white Australia policy. And
wait a minute. We're white.
Yeah.
Oh, no, buddy.
I yield back.
And this is, of course, a time when European colonial powers are very much trying to establish a white presence in the Pacific beyond even, just Australia and New Zealand,
right.
Fiji and like other, Pacific islands. So yeah, they shut that down. And, despite the fact that it was only supposed to apply to the League of Nations, the symbolism of Woodrow Wilson's opposition to it was not lost on Black Americans at home.
Okay.
And, ironically, in exchange for dropping the clause, Japan got a bunch of former German colonies in the Pacific.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
I can just see the headline: "Racist President Rejects Anti-Racist Proposal from Asian Country."
And it's worth mentioning here, too, that
shock.
That Marcus Garvey at this exact time starts the International League for Darker People with the express purpose of advocating for the rights of non-European peoples in the Paris Peace Conference.
Okay.
And, obviously he's not as much of a force to be reckoned with, but there are indications that Garvey and his people had made connections with Japanese government and intelligentsia through this international movement.
Ooh.
And that's, again, kind of important for how this develops.
Well, they were also shared circles with Lawrence Dennis, then potentially, if they were moving in these like ambassadorial circles from Japan in the West Coast.
Garvey, I think, wasn't really.
He wasn't. Okay.
I mean, but he wanted to, but they didn't really give him the time of day for that.
That would have been, I would have just killed to have heard them chat.
Yeah. But I mean, so even so after World War I and throughout the interwar period, Japan did vocally support the cause of not just African Americans, but, the non-white world in general.
Yes. And
there are multiple novels written by Black novelists, even accounts of lynchings that were translated into Japanese and were actually quite popular in Japan at the time, kind of highlighting the hypocrisy of American criticisms of Japanese imperialism.
Yeah.
Which is what anybody does when they criticize the U.S., because it is a very obvious hypocrisy to point out.
Okay, this is a crazy reference. We might have even made it before, but there is this nuts Nintendo game from like the 80s where you go on you start as like a Japanese boy in Japan and you go on this like time traveling adventure that at some point takes you to Reconstruction America in the South, where you have to like escape a lynching or something like this.
Wow.
So, I mean, maybe it, left a mark in the culture.
I mean, it might have. Apparently, there were some pretty popular novels written in Japan on this subject as well. Yeah. I forget Salvador Falcon and I were actually looking up this guy. There's a famous Japanese general who, before World War II, wrote a fictional story. I think it's in probably in Gerald Horne's book about this, where it's a fictional account of a war between the U.S. and Japan, where Japan allies with Black Americans led by Marcus Garvey, and they topple the U.S. government. And so, I mean, these kinds of narratives and stories were very popular in Japan at the time,
and totally doable in Hearts of Iron, probably.
And so Japan also not just publicizing like the plight of Black Americans and, Asian immigrants in the U.S. And of course, the 1926 Immigration Act that restricts immigration from Asia. I believe 1926.
God, that sounds right to me.
Factors very heavily in Japanese narratives about unfair treatment of Asians in America as well.
Years is one of my weak points as a historian.
It's one of my weak points as well. I mean, who the fuck cares? I mean, it is important, but I do generally tend to speak more in decades than I got 1931 and 2 wrong.
Look, you also we don't have to argue that strongly that there was a lot of anti-Asian racism in America in the interwar. Right. I mean, we've done multiple episodes that don't even talk about it directly, but have it all around in the periphery. You know what I mean? It's never not here. So, yeah.
And then Japan also, there's popular sentiment in Japan against the Italian invasion of Ethiopia. That's also something that's publicized in black press in the U.S., including the Black Dragon Society was very upset about that, even though the Japanese government eventually does recognize, Italy's right to conquer Ethiopia.
Yeah.
So by the time the 1930s roll around, there are several explicitly pro-Japan groups that begin to emerge throughout the United States. And when the FBI gets around to investigating and pursuing seditious activities before and after Pearl Harbor, the consensus seemed to be that the elusive Japanese ultranationalist Black Dragon Society was responsible for organizing these subversive activities.
I have subpoenas for everyone in this room.
And we won't really go into the Black Dragon Society too much because, it's really not the evidence for them doing all of this is not too great, even though, like I said, if you read US press from the time, full page newspaper with, illustrations of these dragons and all this kind of stuff, secret society. But, it is interesting. The Black Dragon Society is kind of like a Black Hand. Interestingly enough, because it's basically a ultranationalist paramilitary organization that works within the state. Had its people in intelligence and the military.
Also formed in the beginning of the 20th century,
and also originally had a more Pan-Asian focus. And then kind of goes into this extreme Japanese nationalism. Because actually the name Black Dragon comes from the translation of the Japanese name for the Amur River, which is the border now between China and Russia.
Okay.
Which was supposed to be, the border of Japan, of Japan, which makes it, I guess, kind of more like Luburich's Drina.
Okay.
but it being this kind of secret ultranationalist organization within the state that has power to kind of dictate activities and and all that. It is a really interesting group, but I don't think that it's necessarily hard at work in the US.
Well, also, this was also a time, I think we talked about this also in the Lawrence Dennis episode, where there was an interest in having all of these sorts of very public sedition trials were starting or about to start, or, they would go through several rounds of these things where they would basically bend over backwards to lay American fascism on anyone else except the ruling class of the USA.
Right. And that's in the case of white fascist groups.
Yes.
In the case of any kind of black organizing in the US, it's always blamed on some sort of outside agitator, right?
Yeah.
That, they couldn't possibly do anything themselves.
Well, they can't accept that there's an actual fucking grievance,
right?
They have to be manipulated.
It must be
somehow.
the Black Dragon Society or the KGB
outside agitators
or whatever, the Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, this logic survives to this day, no?
No, absolutely. Yeah.
And
absolutely.
not by among the Nazis, in the liberal mainstream media as well.
I was thinking about CNN and the protests. I mean, this is basically their narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the extent that the Japanese government or the Black Dragon Society, the role that they actually played is kind of hard to establish. There definitely were some agents that worked pretty much explicitly with the Japanese government, working in California and the like, also largely with Asian immigrants and Asian immigrant communities, and then some that were kind of making it to Black communities as well. There's some famous guys like Yusuichi Hikida, who was a Japanese intellectual living in the U.S. He helped organize Du Bois's Japanese tour in the late 1930s.
Okay.
And this is something that would come up later in some investigations as well. and obviously he's pro-Japanese government.
Huh.
But most of the actual quote unquote evidence that comes for a more radical Black Dragon Society connection more or less point to one individual who's this guy Satokata Takahashi.
Okay, you mentioned him in the introduction, I believe.
I did. I mean, he's a major character here. I mean, it's a very weird story. So Takahashi's biography is pretty sketchy, which kind of leads me to believe that he was maybe actually some sort of intelligence asset, or just a grifter and a scammer, or both.
I mean, that's often the case. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, according to the historian Ernest Allen Jr., Takahashi was born Nakane in Japan in 1875 and immigrated first to Canada and somewhere around the turn of the century.
Mm-hmm.
It's not exactly clear when. He married a Canadian woman. They eventually moved to the U.S. He falls on financial hard times, ditches his family, and kind of disappears for the better part of a decade before resurfacing in the 1930s, in the early 30s in Chicago, where he, as Satokata Takahashi, takes on a different name. That's what he's in U.S. immigration records as, although Canadian immigration records have his previous name. And so he shows up in these Garveyist Unia Liberty Halls, kind of speaking to Black audiences about the Japanese empire and its advocacy for the non-white world.
Interesting.
And he begins presenting himself as a retired Japanese army major. So he's known as Major Takahashi.
Okay.
I think that they sometimes call him the little major because he's very short.
Okay.
And among other things, he presents himself as some sort of doctor and like Shinto priest.
Okay. He's got them all covered.
U.S. immigration authorities.
All right.
But he first comes to the attention of the FBI for his connection to Marcus Garvey's Unia movement promoting Japanese interests.
I see.
And it's important to mention, like I said earlier, that most of the pro-Japanese agitation utilized the existing networks of Garvey's Unia, Universal Negro Improvement Organization, Association, infrastructure, which, at this time, the 20s and 30s are really kind of their heyday.
Yeah.
This is when they have, tens of thousands of members, halls all over the United States, but also, in the Caribbean, Latin America. They're doing pretty major things. And so and obviously Garvey is open to this message.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of mostly where this kind of agitation is happening, at least on the part of Takahashi. And it's, again, really important to mention, and this is brought up by a lot of historians as well, that the repression of any kind of Black left organizing at this time really opens the door for pro-Japanese sentiment.
Yeah.
Because they seem not to care about that as much.
Mm-hmm.
And, this gets into the whole complications of, Garvey's relationship to like white racists who are more than happy to, send Black people to Liberia on the Black Star Line and the like.
Right.
But ironically, the U.S. ends up going to war with Japan, and this becomes a much bigger problem.
Yeah.
But in the 30s, since they're clamping down on all these on the Black left.
Yeah.
This kind of shit flourishes a lot more.
Mm-hmm. It's hard to ignore the feeling that somehow I feel like Japan accidentally saved the U.S. from fascism. Like, were it not for, bringing the U.S. into the war, they had a pretty good chance in some cases. I'm not talking about these guys. I'm talking more about the ruling classes. I mean, they were, they had to be convinced. Who knows? Alternate histories. Look, I'm getting older now. That's when you start writing these things.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you start locking yourself up in the basement with your books, You goddamn kids.
I mean, we know that like a lot of the elite wealthy people in the US had lots of sympathies for various aspects of fascism.
Yeah, they're a very sympathetic bunch.
Including academics.
Oh yeah.
When we talk about eugenicists and also all kinds of people, wealthy, intelligence, politicians, so on. So yeah.
Yeah.
But the whole Second World War thing kind of made it difficult.
Yeah.
Awkward.
Yeah, awkward. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's also worth mentioning that, like Unia and Garveyism, a lot of some of the groups that pop up that are explicitly pro-Japanese, like the Japanese, like the Pacific Movement for the Eastern World, have a kind of Garveyist colonization idea of, facilitating. Japan will help facilitate African Americans moving to Africa. There's also some weird colonization scheme in Brazil that they would establish a Black American colony in Brazil with the help of Japan. I'm not sure how that was supposed to work, and that was definitely 100% a scam. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But informants to the U.S. government claim that Takahashi himself stated that he was a member and working on the behalf of the Black Dragon Society.
Okay.
And he says this too, apparently to the FBI, but this is already when he's in prison. And I'm not sure if, he's just like, yeah, whatever. I'm a member or not. Although he also claimed that he wasn't actually working on behalf of the Japanese government. But, there really isn't that much concrete evidence one way or the other. But as I mentioned before, Takahashi's possibly most interesting connection was that to the Black Muslim movements.
Yeah.
And the emergent nation of Islam. And that's through his new wife, Pearl Sherrod. And Pearl Sherrod was an African-American woman who grew up in West Virginia before settling in Detroit later in life. And she was involved in the early Black Muslim movement in Detroit and would eventually come to be one of the most important leaders and leader of the Detroit-based organization, The Development of Our Own, which is a pretty interesting organization. And so it's most likely through her that Takahashi meets Wallace D. Farad, or Farad Muhammad, the founder of the Nation of Islam, and of course his disciple Elijah Muhammad.
Yeah.
And the Development of Our Own advocated, among other things, for this kind of Black Asian unity led by Japan. That was a major part of their politics, and even in like their program.
Yeah.
And they have like a 5-point program.
And this is specifically on political relations with Japan.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Here. This is Takahashi speaking.
Okay.
For at like a meeting of the Development of Our Own. I come here to promote international unity between the dark people of Japan and dark people of America to lead them to a better and fuller life. What Japan has done in the past 70 years, the Negroes too can do by accepting Japan's 5 guiding principles. The white man will give you little. If you obtain anything, it will be done through conquest. You must fight. Japan has succeeded because everyone worked as a unit. You must work as a unit. Follow Japan's guiding principles. Japan is a world power equal to Great Britain and the United States, and fearing nothing but God. He says 3/4 of the world are black people and 1/4 is white, and it is not in accordance with God's will for 1/4 of the world to rule 3/4, which are black. Now that Japan has gained rightful recognition in the world, she is willing to help other dark races. We know that the black people of the United States are citizens thereof and cannot help Japan directly in the case of war, but there are other things that can be done. If the white man knows that you sympathize with Japan, he would allow you to shoulder arms or go near ammunition plant in the case of war. Some parts of this country, you have been shot to death or lynched while wearing the uniform. Japan is making overtures to you. If she fails, you fail. This is the last chance for the dark races of America to overcome white supremacy and to throw white tyrants off your back.
All right.
Which, it's a pretty powerful message.
It's a full ass state, with like a military and yeah.
And it, obviously speaks to a lot of truths that people would be quite, receptive to, no?
It does feel like a Hail Mary pass, but like, one you can see landing for a lot of people. Yeah. Yeah.
But I mean, if you already had considerable sympathy with Japan, somebody that's, a Japanese guy, who is, a former, quote unquote, former army major, whether he was or not, nobody knows.
Yeah.
Telling you to, stand up and fight is a pretty powerful message. So the FBI alleges that Takahashi actually helped channel funds from Japan to the like proto Nation of Islam movements in Chicago and Detroit, and that the Black Dragon Society did all of this, and there was all this money moving around, and that Takahashi's pro-Japanese Pan-Asian agitation maybe helped develop this philosophical principle of the Asiatic black man.
Okay.
That's part of Nation of Islam.
Well, he said
Ideology,
it essentially. I mean, he really made this a very clear connection. When he said specifically the dark peoples of Japan and the US, right?
Yeah. And this is at the time. So, I mean, he's actually friends with Elijah Muhammad.
Yeah, wild.
His wife is like an influential person in these circles.
Ray's kind of thought
Ray's thinking
he's cooking something up.
Ray's like,
there's also like this Fard guy who founded Nation of Islam.
Yeah.
There's also like
it is pronounced Farad.
Okay. There is like this idea that he was before that affiliated with the Moorish Science Temple, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which the Nation of Islam is denying.
Yeah,
but that he was like a prominent member of that other group. So maybe there's
crossover, but again, that's like going into the ideology of Nation of Islam, which gets, I think, kind of beyond the scope of this episode.
Beyond the scope of this specifically episode about Japanese political influence, and
but it is interesting to note that this guy Satokata Takahashi was associates of both Wallace Farad and Elijah Muhammad.
I mean, that's fascinating.
And this gets Elijah Muhammad into trouble during the war. But Takahashi first gets into trouble. So he gets into trouble before the war.
Sure.
So the US government, he comes under the FBI radar pretty quickly because, they have informants in different black nationalist circles who are saying, hey, there's this Japanese guy here. He's associated with the Japanese government. He's saying all this pro-Japanese things, and, blah, blah, blah. So the FBI has their eye on him from earlier on. Then they, of course, accuse him of bringing funds into the country.
Yes. So you're an unregistered foreign agent, right?
Yeah. And beyond that, he didn't immigrate to America first. He came to Canada. So they deport him to Canada.
To his family.
His family seemed to have disappeared at the time. He has a new family.
Okay. Right.
With what's her name? Pearl Sherrod.
Yeah.
But there's actually some strife now going on within the organization, development of our own with the Sherrod's leadership, and things are kind of starting to fall apart. But either way, he gets kicked out to Canada, and then eventually tries to come back into the US, gets arrested for illegal entry into the US and for trying to bribe an immigration official.
Yeah.
So he gets 3 years in federal prison in 1939.
Okay.
So right before the war. He gets out. They release him in 1942.
Interesting.
Which obviously not for long, because then he's immediately once more detained as a dangerous enemy agent, as a dangerous enemy alien.
But he's like, guys, I was sitting in prison. Like
that doesn't stop them from accusing him of orchestrating the 1943 Detroit race riots.
Really? They're pinning that on this dude, huh?
Yeah, while he was in prison.
No way.
So, he gets released and then redetained in 42, and he stays in prison till 46.
Yeah. Damn.
Yeah. No, he spends the whole war in prison.
I mean, I'm not saying he's not doing some unregistered foreign agenting. I'm just saying he didn't start a race riot.
Kind of hard to do from Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary where he was.
Yeah. Also, probably just guessing, but racism started it.
Yeah.
Just throwing it out there.
Because that's not the only
might not be some Japanese guy
of racial violence happening after World War II starts.
Yes.
So Takahashi's in prison, right?
Yeah.
But his activities were apparently not limited only to his friendship with Elijah Muhammad and the development of our own.
Yeah.
He's also credited with being the founder and the kind of main force, or driving force at least, behind another pro-Japanese group that I mentioned at the beginning of the episode, the Pacific Movement for the Eastern World. And this is what kind of got me started down this path. But this group was led and most likely actually founded by another really shady character who was quite literally a con artist.
Okay.
So the Pacific Movement of the Eastern World seems to have been founded by a Filipino guy by the name of Policarpio Manansala,
Okay.
who went by a lot of aliases,
Okay.
such as Dr. Ashima Takis,
Nice.
Mimo de Guzman,
Oh,
Dr. Itake Ko, and a lot of others.
fantastic. Man.
So Policarpio, I will call him Policarpio. I'll trade out his different aliases when I
Sure.
talk about him, just depending on what period.
What ethnicity he's playing at the
Yeah.
time.
So
Yes.
Policarpio was born in the Philippines in 1900.
Uh-huh.
He served in the U.S. Navy during World War I
Mm.
and was dishonorably discharged.
Mm.
Eventually resurfacing in the United States.
Do we know
Um,
why they kicked him out?
No, we don't.
Hmm.
Or at least not any. Every account that I've read about him just says that he was dishonorably discharged. I haven't seen
Hmm.
what for.
Be interested to know who he served under too. Now that we're getting to know those people a bit better, you know,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
original Plattsburgh group that became the American Expeditionary Force.
Yeah, it's the timeline adds up.
Yeah.
Right? I mean,
Everybody's friends in this arc. It's so tidy.
it
Yeah.
is.
Hmm.
Well, except for so Revelo P. Oliver
Oh, yeah.
appears in 2 of these books that I read about this.
My
Um,
guy.
But in that, like, he really hated the Nation of Islam
Yeah,
and testified a lot against them.
yeah.
But it was funny to see him appear.
Which
in
is
this.
what you would expect from a Nazi, but apparently some of them really like Nation of Islam.
Some did, some didn't. Yeah, the
Yeah.
American Nazi Party certainly did.
Yeah.
But I think Revelo was maybe more of more of an old school racist. It's hard to say. I mean, how do you get
Yeah.
more racist than the American Nazi Party? It's,
Yeah.
Well, they're okay. We're gonna get well.
he was more pro-systemic racism, and no, you can't even say that.
Look,
no, there's a different
look.
shades of white
Conveniently,
racism.
conveniently for this exact problem, as this very arc progresses, we will definitively situate Revelo P. Oliver, I think, and Willis Carto and all those motherfuckers.
We never had an episode on him, right?
Well, now that I have access to a certain book of his that I've been looking for,
Mhm.
I think it is probably getting close to time. Maybe expect that soon.
We mentioned him so much.
Yeah.
Never did an episode on him. It's pretty disgraceful.
It is. It is disgraceful.
You're right.
It's absolutely
right, Ray.
disgraceful that we haven't done an episode for Revelo P. Oliver.
We will. It's coming.
So Policarpio apparently in Chicago started frequenting like black social halls.
Okay.
And it is there that he claims to have met Takahashi, Major Takahashi, who enlisted him in the pro-Japanese campaign. He claims that it was Takahashi that actually started the Pacific movement of the Eastern world.
Okay.
But what seems more likely is that Policarpio saw Takahashi speak, picked up on the developing pro-Japanese sentiments
Mm-hmm.
in certain black circles and decided to capitalize on it quite literally.
Yeah. Okay.
So as Dr. Ashima Takis, he went around different black cultural and political halls, presenting himself as, first of all, as Japanese,
Yeah.
which he wasn't.
Right.
And second of all, as an emissary of the Japanese government,
Just go for it. Just
preaching Afro-Asian unity against the U.S. government.
all right.
And of course, he also wasn't a doctor, but I don't know if I needed to mention the fact that he wasn't a doctor, but he wasn't. So he's not Dr. Ashima Takis. He's not a doctor at all.
Uh-huh.
But despite the fact that he was none of these things,
Yes. Yes.
he began to develop a following.
Okay.
And he moved the headquarters of the organization from Chicago to East St. Louis, Illinois, which is just across the Mississippi from St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay.
East St. Louis held a very particular place in Black history at the time, kind of in very recent memory, as being the site of one of the largest massacres, infamous massacres of Black migrant laborers in 1917. This is more than 150 killed, white mobs rampaging through the city, burned down thousands of buildings, several day orgy of violence.
Yeah.
Another pogrom, as we mentioned.
I'm
Right,
sure
right.
a bunch of familiar Legion names are in there too.
And this was, of course, a great, a very famous pogrom and massacre.
Yeah.
Marcus Garvey spoke directly about that. There was a Unia Hall there. And again, like I said, that's the kind of infrastructure that these guys were working in.
Mm-hmm.
So this, history of this place kind of coupled with the fact that it was the Great Depression,
Yeah.
and provided pretty fertile ground for recruitment. And Dr. Ashima's message was essentially that the U.S. and Japan were on the path of collision, and that he, as an emissary of Japan, would ensure that the Japanese would protect and advance the position of Black people in the U.S. This took various different forms. So in kind of the early period, he said that a Japanese invasion was imminent, and that the Japanese government had plans for land redistribution in the South.
Okay.
Which
In this country?
I'm getting my money's worth out of Rick.
yeah. but Policarpio's scheme was, let's say, multi-layered.
Okay.
And it definitely came at a price.
Okay.
So for $5.50 admission fee per person, that was the fee that would be put into a fund to transport immigrants to Japan,
Okay.
where there would be jobs.
Okay.
This kind of stuff didn't really seem that far off.
Sure.
If you think about the same time, this is when a lot of like Jews from the U.S. moved to the Soviet Union, to Stalin's alternative to Zionism in Siberia,
Yeah.
the Jewish autonomous province. Like, hundreds of American Jews went to the Soviet Union, were given land, worked there.
Yeah.
This kind of stuff. Colonization schemes like this, up until I think after World War II, were considered a pretty normal thing.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah, and
Which
there
we
were
kind of
even-
forget about today.
Not even to mention the like bonkers ones that like American capitalists did privately on their own.
Right.
I mean,
right.
they were real. They were out there. They were employing people.
Sure. Yeah. So, I mean, I could see where that wouldn't really necessarily seem that far off for people. And, some people did sign up on it, and, he took that money. Otherwise, there was a $1 yearly fee, membership fee.
Okay.
Now, of course, like I said earlier, at some point, he also promised that the Japanese government would assist in this colony in Brazil. That none of this was real. I mean, he had no connections that we know of to the Japanese government, other than that he said that he knew Major Takahashi, who he, of course, said was a member of the Black Dragon Society.
Yeah.
And, the kind of puppet master behind all of this. Later, would go kind of in this more traditional direction of providing passage to Liberia. A lot of schemes that involved leaving the U.S., which seems totally understandable given the circumstances that people were living in at the time. And he claimed, in order to gain more members, that, he was part of a much larger network, that they had hundreds of thousands of members nationwide. And for their part, when he did start recruiting people, they did go from city to city, opening chapters, and membership levels are kind of hard to determine because they, of course, inflated their numbers a lot.
Yeah.
And sometimes the FBI would also take their numbers, as they tend to do, right? They take the largest one possible, or, the media, like when we talked about the Sinarchismo too,
right?
Like, they'd say, oh yeah, there's whatever,
hordes,
hundreds of thousands of members of this group. But, for Policarpio, it was absolutely a money-making scheme. And at some point, he just dips out and disappears with the money.
All right.
And he spends the rest of the 30s doing other things. He was a traveling spice salesman, and it didn't seem to actually be as profitable as he thought. But the organization did continue to exist, but under local, Black leadership.
Interesting.
And so some of these people are, again, people that would get rounded up at the beginning of World War II. But one thing that's clear from the leadership of the Pacific movement of the Eastern world in its headquarter towns and kind of throughout where they were, is that, they all kind of shared a common biography of usually being from the South, fleeing racist violence in, the Great Migration north. So, General Lee Butler, which is his name, not a title.
Okay.
Name's General Lee Butler, assumed control of the local East St. Louis headquarters. He comes from, I think, Mississippi originally.
Okay. But he wasn't a general.
He was not a general.
Nor a butler.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
And, like I said, if you look at any of the biographies of these people, it kind of tells you the story of what was going on in preceding decades. So there's a lot of people that come from, that fled, for example, the famous Red Summer in Arkansas, which is a series of pogroms, famously like the Elaine Massacre in Elaine, Arkansas. And that's mostly the kind of biographies you're dealing with.
Yeah, right.
With people.
Yeah.
With like the leadership and membership of the organization.
Mm-hmm.
And it took on a life of its own. So
sorry, just describing, I don't know how many fucking racial pogroms you've mentioned already, maybe 4 at this point.
A lot.
And I love that these guys are like, it's that fucking Takahashi guy.
Yeah, it's the Takahashi guy. There's no reason that these, that they want to organize self-defense groups. Because one of the things that starts happening is that, it's unclear, how much guys like General Lee Butler were in it for the grift, or, how much they actually believed they were doing the right thing.
Yeah.
So, they're promoting the idea that, again, a Japanese invasion was imminent, and local chapters started establishing kind of gun clubs where they would, do military drills. This, again, would work against them when the federal government actually decided to crack down.
Yeah.
But you see that when they do crack down and when they do take weapons, you're dealing with like a very small amount. So this idea that it was, the Japanese government was channeling money for these, fifth columnists that are, they pick up like a handful of rifles, shotguns, pistols, shit that,
God, that sounds so fucking familiar.
That you can buy in the U.S.
So the usual.
The usual, right.
All right. Meanwhile, the fucking, 40 years later, Bob Matthews is rolling around with a fucking rocket-propelled grenade launcher.
Yeah, but the Second Amendment always terrifies Americans when it's black people.
Oh yes,
right. I mean, this is
obviously
with the Panthers just a few decades later it becomes a major issue. No.
Yes.
It'd be awesome if someone wrote like a novel about these like worst fears of like white people in America coming true.
It's fashic. We've covered a lot of it,
but not fashic. Like it was actually cool, like not written by fascists.
Yeah. There is like kind of revenge fantasies,
or just like Japanese people starting like doing that, financing like black resistance groups and like fucking up the states. And
I mean, there's the excellent movie the Spook Who Sat by the Door.
Oh yeah, right.
Which is kind of an inversion of the kind of blaxploitation genre in that it's like they organize a revolution and are successful.
Yeah. Maybe we should watch that someday on a slow period. We want to take a little.
There is like a surrealist novel, I think, written by some surrealist guy about like it's a kind of yellow peril kind of fantasy that like I don't know if it's Chinese people or just Asian people who invade Europe, kill the Pope, and put some like
nice.
A woman in his place to be the Pope. It's called something. I think the novel is called something, The Devil's Popess or something. Like that.
I was gonna guess. Is it like She Pope of the East or something?
Yeah,
I was really hoping for Popestress.
Yeah,
but you get what you get.
Yeah, but I think it's actually not written like by racists, but by like surrealists who want to fuck with Christians.
Sure,
like
it's a fun way to do it.
Yeah.
So this is a nice digression. So I mean, so they are doing this kind of stuff. At its height, there maybe are actually a couple thousand members nationwide. It's not like a completely insignificant phenomenon.
Yeah, but people also pulled numbers back then in a way that.
Yeah, but I mean, there might have actually been, enough people, because other groups similar groups start to emerge independently of this.
Mhm.
Kind of, there's the Ethiopian Pacific movement. I'm not sure if the Ethiopian part is referring maybe to the tradition of Ethiopianism, or if it's, in solidarity with
Mhm.
Ethiopianism's a whole movement back then. I believe that the Ethiopian Pacific movement was led by this Jamaican immigrant, Robert O'Jordan, who they called the Black Hitler of Harlem
Nice.
when they round him up in 42.
Wow. What a name. What a confusing name.
Yeah, I mean, there's a New York Times article I pulled up from the time period.
They're calling him the Black Hitler from Harlem.
I don't know if they call him that in this. 6 Harlem fascists deny sedition talk. Basically, they called him this because he was kind of a street preacher in Harlem, and he would, kind of openly talk about hoping that the Japanese win. Not a surprise that he gets rounded up pretty early. I'm calling him Black Hitler instead of, I don't know,
Did he even rock the stash?
Black Hideki Tojo or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm kind of still reaching for that Hitler angle.
I guess maybe maybe they were thinking about like the beer hall era Hitler giving speeches. Like, I don't know if there's
about Japan.
If it goes that deep.
Yeah. Hitler's famous pro-Tojo beer hall speech.
Yeah. So, I mean, there are actually several kind of different spin-off movements that emerge in different cities that are kind of more or less promoting some sort of variation of pro-Japanese Black nationalism.
Mm-hmm.
There are these stories that get told a lot that, that they were instructed that when the Japanese invade, to put up black or purple, depending on who you read, cloth in your window, and then the Japanese forces will know that you're on their side. Ideologically, the Pacific movement of the Eastern world is, I would say, kind of more Unia derived. And it even adopted like early slogans that sounded a lot like Unia kind of Garveyism. So, for example, I have their principles here, and it's pretty basic stuff. So the 8 stated aims are universal brotherhood and peace, promotion of understanding and friendship of all peoples of the world, preservation and protection of legal rights of the oppressed races, self-determination of every race, reforms through constitutional methods, interesting, preservation of the territorial integrity and political independence of every country, cultivation of the spirit of love for the ancestral homes of dark peoples, the encouragement for the return of those peoples who find no opportunity for development in the United States, and the establishment of a government of their own in the land of their fathers. So this is kind of different from some of the other programs that we've read in this show.
Yeah, but you can also see where there are these like points where the boundary layer kind of thins out, and you can start to see how if fascist or imperialist interests might have been able to sneak through some messaging here.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, because part of so below, then it says, sow no evil to reap the good, Asia for the Asiatics, Africa for the Africans, at home and abroad.
Well, how did they consider the United States as a territory? Like, whose was it? Were they somehow in solidarity with like Native American movements as well?
I've seen very little reference to indigenous movements in the U.S. and their relationship to these groups in particular. I think you'd probably find your answer in Garvey and what like Unia's positions were there. Because even, in some of the books that I've read about this, members that joined the Pacific movement, some of them thought of it as an outgrowth of Unia specifically.
Okay, yeah.
And so they would have had that kind of ideological familiarity with Garvey's works and thoughts. Okay. But yeah, I'm not sure about that. It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that there was some of this is also tied into some ideas for Black self-determination in the U.S., which a lot of times was open to all non-white peoples.
Uh-huh.
I mean, this is a part of the ideology of the Pacific movement of the Eastern world too, is that it's not exclusively black. It's as they say, for the black, yellow, and brown.
Yeah, right.
Brown, I don't know if that includes Native people or not.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm.
I'd assume it does actually. So yeah, kind of interesting principles there.
Yeah.
There's a whole creed too. I don't know if I need to read that though. It's cool. I'll actually post up a picture of it. So,
great. Perfect.
Yeah.
Well, it's a perfect reason to check out our Patreon. Yeah, we tend to put up the pictures there for anybody who doesn't know. Yeah.
Like I said, although there was initial enthusiasm and, membership potentially in the thousands, that organization and many others kind of started to naturally peter out by the end of the 1930s.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, by the time, and they're being investigated the whole time.
Yeah.
More or less by the FBI. Mm-hmm. For some groups, the FBI determined that they weren't particularly a threat. Others, and they kept them under surveillance as they do. But of course, when Pearl Harbor rolls around, the U.S. government decides to crack down, regardless of whether or not they considered each individual group to be a threat.
Okay.
So the 1942, the U.S. government conducts a bunch of raids in Chicago, New York, rounding up a lot of people, like for example Robert O. Jordan in Harlem. Most notably, also Elijah Muhammad gets picked up in these raids and is investigated for his potential seditious activity. The advocating that black people don't sign up for the draft, or this kind of thing.
Yeah, stuff that later also the FBI was interested if Lawrence Dennis was in fact engaged in exactly that activity.
Right, exactly.
So that's why
where
they got it from. Yeah,
and there's some kind of outlandish statements too from from like U.S. officials who are talking about black Muslims, and they're like, well, the Muslims are a martial race. They're fighters. Well, why would they not want to enlist and fight?
Didn't Hitler say something like that too?
Yeah,
right.
But I mean, this is the common,
or more Himmler, probably.
More Himmler.
Yeah. They got the curved blades. You're gonna love them.
Yeah. So I mean, this is the kind of line of thought. Oh, the Muslims, they like war, don't they?
I see. Right. Yes.
Why wouldn't these guys want to go join a segregated unit commanded by like Southern white officers? Where I mean, like,
it's just logical.
I mean, like, even like medical supplies and like blood is segregated.
Yeah. Yes.
I mean, this is what we're talking about here. This is
Jesus.
And like, I think it's important also for maybe European listeners who perhaps
it was such a big issue. The fucking blood transfusions during wartime. That was such a big fucking controversy.
Yeah.
That's how fucking insane these people all were at this time. And you needed the blood or you would die. And you were like, well, I don't know. I've heard things, you see.
They're not like us.
I think I'll just wait it out.
Yeah.
I mean, that's okay with me.
A bunch of dumb white people who don't want to take blood transfusions.
Just bled out. Racism.
The bigger problem was that they wouldn't have enough blood for black soldiers to get transfusions. They wouldn't get enough white blood.
Of course.
That's this is again the kind of shit we're talking about here.
It's hell, of course.
And so like a lot of notable people get picked up. I believe Takahashi's wife also gets picked up in these raids as well. Yeah, and this is where you start getting the really outlandish, also like media stories about the conspiracies and the black dragons and this, that, and the other thing. And this much like the von Siatsky case, and much like what the federal government does anyway, if there's not a strong case, they'll find the kind of most unreliable witnesses to say whatever. So you get all these stories of John Doe Japanese agents, like all these unnamed Japanese guys who were kind of calling the shots in different cities and doing this, that, or the other thing.
Yeah.
Most of which, of course, doesn't really seem to be true.
Yeah.
At the same time, as we said at the top of the episode, the U.S. government is getting concerned with this potential security problem of, oh, hey, maybe a bunch of people aren't, super enthusiastic about the war effort. Racial violence doesn't stop or subside really much at all. So, just over a month after Pearl Harbor, you get a very famous lynching of Cleo White in Sikeston, Missouri, which is not far away from St. Louis, of course, in the headquarters of the Pacific Movement of the Eastern World.
Mm-hmm.
And, very close to that site of that other big pogrom in 1917.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because Wright is, as these things typically go, accused by a white mob of assaulting a white woman.
Yeah.
Who notably her husband is away in the military.
Okay.
And it's a brutal lynching, as most are. They drag him around the town in a car tied to the bumper, and they set him on fire in front of a black church during Sunday services.
God damn.
This, of course, the fact that the husband was away in the military then perpetuates again this notion of black disloyalty, similar to what we talked about with the Zoot Suit riots in California, right? This idea that Chicanos are a fifth column. They don't care about the war like, we do or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like I said at the top of the episode, again, you get 1943, Detroit. That gets blamed on a Japanese man who was in prison. Again, major racial violence in Detroit. And there are more. I think there's in Houston, some notable like race riots. I mean, there's a lot of shit going on. So it's not stopping at all. And of course, this is right after Pearl Harbor.
Yeah, that's what's very. I mean, it's very interesting connection. So let me just make sure that I understand then. So you are saying then, or rather, maybe this research suggests that that these pogroms, riots, whatever you want to call them, have a direct link. Actually, do have a direct link to Pearl Harbor through these panics about Black Fifth Column.
Seemingly specifically in this case, and also that the U.S. government, unlike in many other pogroms and lynchings, decides to try to prosecute this the Sikeston.
Yeah.
But of course, nobody gets convicted.
Yeah, right.
But they have
some very stern words. I'm sure.
Yeah, they put in an effort.
We're against all forms of violence.
Yes.
I mean, this is usually a typical thing with these things. I mean, in the East St. Louis pogrom 1917, over 150 black people are killed, like a couple white people, most like one cop, whatever. And they still manage to jail more black people for it than they do white people. They jail like 4 white people and like 20 black people.
Amazing.
So, I mean, yeah. But, the U.S. government is quote unquote recognizing that there's an issue.
Well, at least tactically.
And this is again where that Double V campaign comes in.
Yeah.
A lot of these accounts talk about how, the black, like mainstream press is pushing the issue of the Sikeston lynching along with Pearl Harbor, right? And the war effort. And, that kind of brings me to a kind of greater, maybe should mention a little bit of like the criticism of this, because, not all sectors of black society were pro-Japanese.
Well, of course.
Obviously, it did seem to cut across class lines.
Yeah.
As in you had people like Du Bois up there who were, quite enthusiastic about it. But then you also have like the rank and file and laborers or whatever in like East St. Louis who were part of the Pacific Movement of the Eastern World.
But all that matters is the panic, really, right?
Yeah. I mean, it speaks to obviously this greater issue of what's going on in America and people being like, oh, maybe there's a hope elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
But, so Du Bois is writing about very controversially now, like the Japan's achievements, including in like colonizing Manchukuo, that it's, for the better. There are articles that come out in black newspapers that call China the Uncle Tom of Asia or whatever. They like Japan is teaching people to stand up and, whatever. There's a lot of ignoring of that. But
shout
then,
out to John Paul Cupp if he's listening.
But of course, there's guys like Langston Hughes, who has a tour in Japan in the 30s and gets deported because he's making connections with Japanese leftists. And if there's major repressions against, communists in Japan, leftists in Japan. Before even the 30s.
Yeah. And then, after the war, and then pretty much continuously.
Right.
Since then.
And then, Paul Robeson specifically says that Japan is a fascist country, but that is support for fascism. And a lot of the mainstream press was definitely more critical. Even like, I guess what you'd call centrist, journalists and the like. There are exceptions. There were centrist journalists who were writing pro-Japanese stuff as well, although that seems to kind of end by the time Pearl Harbor comes around. So, this ends, these movements definitely end.
Yes.
Right. At least the ones that were founded to be pro-Japanese.
Right.
People get out of jail. It's kind of forgotten about, but it's interesting that, like, for example, the Nation of Islam only rises really after this, right? In the 1950s is when they start getting their, major membership and solidifying the ideas and, and become a major force.
But with these networks intact, right? These pre-war networks.
Well, yes and no. Those pre-war networks exist one way or the other.
Sure.
So like, in the sense that like state repression here didn't necessarily do too much damage to, say, like the Black nationalist movement.
Sure.
Or,
okay.
Not as much as it would, later on.
Right. Yes.
That being said, there was this tendency to try to pin this all on kind of a foreign plot, which, to some extent existed, right? There were, like I said, Japanese agents actually working in these communities and the like.
Yeah, let's put it like this. Lucky for the feds, there actually was kind of one, right?
Right.
But if there wasn't one, they probably would have come up with something anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
But in many respects, it's just a fifth column that never was.
Right.
It absolutely never had the kind of funding or strength or whatever. It's telling that even when the grift was up for Policarpio and he dips out, it continues on its own kind of momentum because it did, speak to something that people wanted at the time, and that's kind of self-defense or help from abroad, and, fixing the horrible situation that existed in the US.
Yeah.
And so in that way, like I said at the top of the episode, it's completely different from like the Bunds or from any of these other organizations who really, didn't really have a bone to pick with the US government in the same way. They just thought, okay, we'll need to get them on our side. And, they were white guys who were fascists.
Well,
very, very different situation here.
Many of our stories end thusly.
I think we did mention in one of the previous episodes, not so recently, that there were like factions inside of the German Nazis who had a little bit of this kind of anti-imperialist talk and so on.
Yeah.
I think
absolutely.
we mentioned, maybe, was it Karl Haushofer who was part of that?
We did mention Haushofer. I don't remember the context.
Well, actually, if you remember the episode that we did about the Across the Atlantic to the Partisans,
yeah, right.
When the Yugo guys are in, where are they in the Caribbean? I forget. They're when the British colonies in the Caribbean, and they're talking to those Black and Asian sailors who are like, when we got sunk, the U-boat guys gave us, anti-British imperialist propaganda.
Right.
Yeah. And they didn't really think much of it, but like, there was that anti-imperialist tendency, which I guess manifested itself mostly in the Middle East. Right.
I think so. Yeah. But there was also like, there was some like Indian support for Nazis.
Yeah. And there's some of that as well in the US. these accounts from California of this like panic about like the Asians and the Hindus coming together with the, you know, blah, blah, blah.
They're going to be cursed by God.
Exactly right. Yeah, Rick. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great.
But yeah, again, this is largely a problem of the U.S. government's own creation in the sense that,
Yes.
you know, through the repression of of a lot of other elements, they allowed if the Japanese agents that were there to spread their message.
Yeah.
Because at least it wasn't, you know, the Kremlin doing.
You know what? I read that one of the terms used at the time to describe, you know, Asian people, of course, we talked about the word celestial in the past, but there was another one I learned recently, and that was sons of heaven, which I thought was pretty sweet.
Well, that's not as bad as what Harry Truman apparently thought as a young man. It was a quote that came up in one of these books. Speaking to Harry Truman's
summarize it?
extreme racist upbringing and racism in general, where he's speaking about how his uncle told him that white people were made of dust.
Oh no.
N-word of mud. And then God threw whatever else up in the air. What came down was Chinese people.
The fuck? That's not even a full joke. That's like he started one and gave up.
Yeah. I mean, this is who becomes president.
Yeah. Well, and then kills tons of Asian people.
Yeah.
I mean, Jesus Christ. Yeah. In like a world historical manner as well. Harry Truman. Harry Truman.
Homo satanicus.
There we go. Now I can use it. Finally. All right, guys. Well, anything you want to wrap up with here?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a pretty kind of general overview.
I think it could have been a lot more general from the sound of what you telling me about the readings that you had and like the amount of text. That's like,
yeah.
I mean it's, we kept a pretty good focus, I'd say.
Yeah. Again, I focus more on the kind of shady grifter characters that emerged in
That's
this.
what we do.
That is what we do.
It's part of what we
they're
do.
always there.
Yeah.
Those types.
Sure. Yeah. And not just for the fash either.
No.
They're everywhere.
This is just kind of a sad, fucked up story in some ways.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Yes. It's also completely absurd. It's also a very interesting. I mean, it could be a very dark comedy about the FBI or about the feds in a way too, because it's funny how ready they are to do anything, to drop any amount of money into all sorts of investigations, even, you know, whether it's federal or like journalistic or whatever, in order to avoid understanding why these people are very angry.
Yeah.
You know, they go to such great lengths to not think about it.
And then when it finally hits them in the face, when the war starts and they're taking these surveys, they're like, oh, holy shit.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, you didn't think of that before.
It's my sad trombone for dumb white people.
Indeed.
All right,
guys. See you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Hey there, all you free people enjoying your free episodes from The Empire Never Ended. Maybe scoot on over to patreon.com/tenepod and become a patron. We publish 3 additional premium episodes there alongside the 2 freebies each month. We're on Twitter too, also at Tenepod, but our Patreon is really where it's at. See you there, maybe?